This lesson is how to loop over data in C#. The objectives for this lesson are to learn the different types of looping constructs that are available to us in C#, the appropriate use of the while loop, when to use the do loop, see the various ways to use the for loop, iterate over collections using foreach. Looping constructs are used when you need to be able to iterate over a series of statements. And we have different structures in C# that we can use. We have a while, a do while, a for, and a foreach. The while loop tests the loop condition before executing the statement or statements. So we do a while, some condition is true, go in and execute the statement or statements. Now they may or may not execute the statements depending on that condition. If the condition evaluates to false, it won't even go in and execute any of the statements. Let's take a look at the while loop. To illustrate the while loop, I'm going to create an integer variable called index and set it to 1. I'm then going to create a while, and inside of the parentheses I'm going to have my condition. And the condition is while index is less than 10. So the first time through, index is 1. So that's less than 10. Line 4, it writes out the console.writeLine on that index. And then on line 6, it performs an index plus plus. Now it hits this end curly brace and it goes back to the top of the loop and tests the condition again. So index now is 2, still less than 10. It drops in and repeats the console.writeLine on that index and increments the index again. And it does this until index is no longer less than 10. At that point, it exits the loop and goes to line 8. And then line 9, console.readKey. So let's go ahead and run this, and we can see the result. So it went 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Now, remember after it printed out the 9, index was incremented by 1, and now index is not less than 10, it's equal to 10. That's what then caused it to break out of the loop. When using a while loop, you need to be sure that you are doing something to change the condition. Here I'm doing an index plus plus. What would happen if I removed that index plus plus? That's right, you're going to have just an infinite loop. It's going to keep looping and looping because there is no way it's going to change to be greater than 10, so it's going to run over and over again. I'll go ahead and press Control-C to stop it. Close the window, and then I would want to make sure I put back the valid loop. Our next looping construct is a do while loop. This is where you now test the loop condition at the end of the loop. So that makes sure it's always going to go through the statement or statements at least one time. So we start this construct with a do. We then use our curly brace. We list any statements. We close the brace, but then we add while, and then we put our condition down here, and then the semicolon. So this always executes the statements at least one time. So let's take a look at a do while loop. I'm going to use the same sample that we used for the while, but I've switched it around. Now I put the do, followed by an open curly brace, the console.writeLine, the index plus plus, and then while, index less than 10. So it's always going to at least go in and execute those two lines at least one time. So if we run this, we should see the same result. Once it's done, it continues on with the rest of the program, which in this case is console.readKey. If I were to change this to index maybe less than 1, well, now you can see it still goes in and at least does something one time, right? Because it says I'm going to go do these two and then I'm going to test the condition. Now, if we were to put back the loop that we had before and I was to change this to less than 1 and now we run this, notice we get nothing because it tested the condition prior to going in and executing those statements. Whereas with the do loop, it always does the statements at least one time. A for next loop is probably the most common looping construct you'll use. It's used when you know the amount of iterations you're going to go through or that number of iterations can be calculated for the condition that you're testing. The for syntax looks like this. We do for and an open close parenthesis, and within the parentheses we have three statements. The first statement is the initialization of some incrementing variable or decrementing variable. The second statement in there is the condition that you want to test on that variable. And then the third statement is how you're going to increment or decrement that variable. And then within the curly braces, we put our statement or our statements. So let's take a look at a for next loop. In this sample on line 1, for, open parenthesis, int index equals 1. So that's our initialization and declaration of this indexing variable called index, semicolon, index less than or equal to 10, semicolon, index plus plus. So that's telling it how we're going to increment. And then we just have the one line in here, console.writeLine, and we're going to display index. Now in line 5, I've commented out this code, but I wanted to show you how we get the red squiggly, right? So that's an error. It says the name index does not exist in the current context. That's because index is actually a local variable to the for block. Everything between a opening brace and a closing curly brace, that's a block of code. If you declare a variable inside of there, it is only available within that block. So index is not available outside of the for loop. Well, let's go ahead and run this, and we should now see the numbers 1 through 10. I changed this a little bit from the do and the while loop because I did less than or equal to 10. But let's take a look at a couple of other iterations or different ways that you can write the for. So for example, I can take out the initialization and I can add it up here outside of there. Now, if we were to put back that line of code that I had before, you can see index is now available because it was declared outside of the for. Let's do another thing. Let's go ahead and make it index less than or equal to 20, but instead of doing a plus plus, let's do a compound assignment here, and let's increment that by 2. So let's run this. Now we see 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, 13, 15, 17, 19, 21. Okay, well, if we were to take a look at this, the index is less than or equal to 20. However, because I'm incrementing by 2, it was at 19, and then it went to 21. That caused it to print, but then it tested the condition on the next line. It said, now we're done. You got to be careful with your indexing, with your incrementing, how you're doing this, because you could get a situation like this. So it generally doesn't happen if you're incrementing by ones, but be careful with this. Another thing that we could do here, if we put this back, we can still index this at, instead of 1, let's index this at 20. And we'll do index greater than or equal to 0. And this time we'll do an index minus equals 2. I need to take away the console.writeLine because index is no longer available. But what we're doing now is we're decrementing by 2. Let's go ahead and run this, and we should see the output is 20, 18, 16, all the way down to 0. Another common looping construct you'll use is foreach. This is used typically to iterate over items in a collection or an array. Now, we haven't covered these yet, but I think everybody gets the idea of a collection or an array. So we would use foreach, and then within the parentheses, you would specify a variable name and then use the keyword in, and then the name of your collection or your array. And then, of course, the open curly brace, whatever statement or statements you want, and then a closing curly brace. Well, let's take a look at a foreach loop. Even though we haven't covered collections or arrays, we have looked at the string data type and a character data type. Well, it turns out that a string is simply a collection of character types. So in this case, we have 10-speed bicycle. The 1 is a character, the 0 is a character, the space is a character, the S is a character, the P is a character, etc., all the way through. So we can use a foreach to iterate over the characters in name, grab each character and put it into that variable CHR, and then on line 4, we can display that character on the console. So let's go ahead and try running this. And now we should see each character in that string displayed. So this was iterating over that collection of characters and displaying each one on the console. So for each, always used for collections or arrays. And we'll see more examples of that later in this course. At some point when you're looping, you may wish to, based on some condition, exit out of a loop. Well, we can do that by using a break statement. So here's an example. For int index equals 0, index less than or equal to 10, index plus plus. And then we put an if statement within the for. And we say if index is equal to 5, break. So what would happen is the first time in, it's going to skip the if statement because index is not equal to 5. So it'll display console.writeLine index. So 0 gets displayed. It increments the index by 1. It's now equal to 1. And it keeps going through until index is equal to 5. When that happens, the break statement happens, which means it goes to the line after the for loop. And it continues on with whatever code is there. In this lesson, we looked at while loops, which may or may not execute the statements within the while block. We looked at do loops, which always executes those statements at least one time. We saw for loops, which is used when you know the number of iterations or that value can be calculated. And we looked at for each loops to iterate over collections or arrays. Coming up in the next lesson, Introduction to Object-Oriented Programming.